For the past 10 days, I've been listening to this online course by the writer Charles Eisenstein on political hope. Charles Eisenstein is a well-established thinker, author who talks about a range of different topics from the economy to climate change to spirituality to social change. And I'll put a link at the bottom of this video to anyone interested in looking at this course. What I want to do in this video is a little review of the sort of things that he says and how I personally relate to that. Not just my ideas, but my own life. So Eisenstein begins by looking at how kind of hopeless our current political situation is. We currently have like an entrenched divide in our politics. He talks a lot about the US, but I think it also applies to politics in the UK and Europe and beyond. We demonize the other side, so people on the left often call people on the right stupid or selfish, whereas people on the right call people on the left naive or out of touch, and there's very little constructive discussion between the two sides. There's kind of fierce debate. We look for knockdown arguments to defeat the arguments of the other side and so on, and social media exacerbates this effect where we have these sort of shouting matches at each other, and it becomes more like a soap opera than some kind of civil discourse. So this is really problematic, right, when there's some huge issues that we all need to be on the same page for, or at least we need to be dealing with effectively. So we have climate change, we have increasing mass inequality, we have other existential threats like nuclear war or potential future pandemics. We have technological mass employment. There are some serious problems in our world that we need to do something about, and it's easy to look at this hopeless state of affairs and feel confused and apathetic and kind of zone out. So what does Charles Eisenstein say in response? He kind of does three things. Firstly, he looks at what he views is the root of this problem, not just our political problem, but many of our problems, which he puts down to essentially a mentality, a story or a mythos of the world. And secondly, he looks at how we can have a different mentality and how we can begin to solve some of these problems with that mentality. And thirdly, he looks at how this different mentality is relatively hopeful. It provides sources of hope for individuals that would otherwise feel disempowered, otherwise feel apathetic and hopeless. So I'm going to just talk about those things briefly, and then talk about how that impacts me in my own life. Firstly, the mentality behind many of these problems. So Charles Eisenstein asked this question at the beginning of the course, which is, what is the origin of the wrongness in the world? Which is a fairly big question, and he believes that the answer to this question is that we have a kind of warlike mentality which is boosted by a story of separation. So we ultimately believe we are separate selves, we are isolated, and we exist in competition with other separate selves, all of which may be threatening for our own survival and well-being. We ultimately live, according to Eisenstein, in a dead and purposeless universes governed by forces beyond our control. And so how well we do in life is really about how we can use our own resources, our own power to gain control or gain domination over these forces that would otherwise gain control and domination over us. And so it's no surprise if we have this kind of fundamental mentality to life, where life is about getting and having as much stuff as possible so that we can control our circumstances. And I've spoken a lot about this in previous videos and in my book, that we see the political situation in this way as well. We want to beat the bad guys. We want to win various political battles or skirmishes. We see that there are these nefarious forces in the world that we have to mobilize against and try as hard as we can through all our might to be victorious over, to gain various political successes, to get our guy in power who's obviously good and get the other guy out of power who's obviously bad, and so on. And there's three kind of major problems with this strategy that Eisenstein talks about. First, it may work in the short term, but it's not necessarily going to work in the long term. So we might, for example, get the particular politician we like in power, but in the next election, it might be that the other side gets in power, or potentially the election after that. So it's a relatively short-termist thinking. Secondly, if we look at politics just about forces against each other, where the powerful forces win, there are some hugely powerful forces that we can't do much about. So if we look at climate change and we look at economies that are partly governed by these huge multinational oil corporations, it's very hard to see how we can go up against those lobbies and really encourage the kind of policies that we need in order to combat climate change. And thirdly, through looking only at these battles, these left versus right, or good guys versus bad guys kind of battles that we see in modern politics, we might lose sight of some of the underlying causes of our problems. So we might, for example, spend all our time talking about prison reform or gun control in the United States, rather than what are the underlying social conditions that cause crime in the first place. Or we might look all about healthcare and try and win those battles about access to treatment and so on, and lose sight of the fact that inequality has such a huge impact on illness and disease. We might spend all our time fighting a battle around helping refugees without even thinking about the global trade agreements that we do with authoritarian regimes where these refugees come from in the first place. So we can potentially lose sight by looking only at the symptoms of social problems if we have this mentality. So kind of moving on, what Eisenstein suggests is that we develop a different mentality, not a warlike mentality, but a more peaceful one. Not a story of separation, but a story of connection. So instead of isolated individual cells, we are all interconnected, is what Eisenstein argues. We don't live in a dead and purposeless universe, but a alive one, a purposeful one that we can contribute towards in all our actions. Life isn't just about a competition between various powerful forces. We can cooperate, we can work together. And so this is a different way of viewing the world and going about life, but also our politics. So people on the other side are in some sense connected to us. The good guys and the bad guys are in some sense the same. They all have a place to play, they all belong. And this might sound really quite difficult to some sort of activist-y ears, and I completely agree, but I think what Charles Eisenstein wants to say is this is our kind of best shot at overcoming some of these huge problems around the short-termism of political discourse, around not getting to the underlying causes of our problems, around the fact that there are some forces that are too big to do anything about. If we see ourselves in this kind of interconnected web, we realize that everything we do can reinforce not a warlike mentality of fighting against forces, but a story that we are all connected, that we're all want effectively the same thing, that if I harm someone else, I essentially harm myself, and vice versa. Life is more about giving and receiving than winning and losing. And so Charles Eisenstein encourages people to really think about how They are looking at the news, how they are engaging in politics. Are they doing it with compassion? Are they doing it with kindness? Are they trying to understand the bad guys? Are they trying to understand the other side? And if we do this, we can begin to do these kind of small actions with the trust, essentially, that because we exist within this complex web of connections, the actions we do that reinforce this different mentality, this different story of the world, this idea of belonging, of connection, that if we do these things, they can have ripple effects that we might never even know about. And so essentially it's this quite hopeful idea that as an individual, you are quite powerless to some extent. Sure, you can vote, you can write to an MP, you can be involved in a protest. And just to kind of be clear, Eisenstein says we should do all those things. They're not bad. We need to do both. We need to see the world in terms of actions we can bring about, in terms of outcomes we can bring about, but ultimately see that we are all connected, and that even the simple actions we can do, such as listening to someone we disagree with, such as showing kindness to a member of the outgroup or whatever, can have extremely profound effects, even if they're not the easily quantitative ones, even if they're not the kind of impacts that are reported in our media and so on. And so personally, there are many things I don't agree with what Eisenstein says, but certainly his distinction between this story of separation and connection coheres with what I talk about in terms of our fundamental capacities, mental capacities for control and connection. So that's the kind of intellectual resonance, but personally, I would consider myself a kind of recovering activist. I 15 years ago now, was much more involved in political actions, in campaigning, and I've really sort of, over the past decade or so, become more and more apathetic, become more and more numb to these issues, as I felt I just don't think we can do anything about these things. I just don't know if me or the groups I am a part of can really make a difference here. And what I see in this different way of looking at things, in looking at how, rather than being separate atomistic individuals up against other big groups of separate atomistic individuals, we're actually all connected in a way where my individual actions can have a huge impact on other people's lives, and that's important. So in a way, how I do something almost has more of an impact than what I do. And so this helps, I now feel like I can watch the news, and rather than kind of categorize something as, that's another thing I need to care about, and sort of shutting off to it, I now realize that actually empathizing with that issue or caring with that issue in part does have an impact. It has an impact in terms of how I treat other people that day. It has an impact in terms of what I might then go on to care about in the future. Just picking one thing that I really feels right to do and doing it from a heartfelt place feels more important when I look at the world in this way. So I encourage you to check out this course by Charles Eisenstein. I encourage you to think about how differently you would see yourself and your actions in the world if, instead of a separate, isolated individual, you saw yourself in this complex, intricate web of living beings, all of which are impacting each other all the time in everything we do. Would you then try to understand things a bit more, try to be more compassionate to those you disagree with, try to be kinder? That's not always the right response, but I feel, personally, that's what happens as a result of this different way of looking at the world for me. Not all the time, but sometimes. So we'll see where that goes. We'll see where this different mentality takes me. I'd love to hear about where it takes you, and I'm sure there'll be many more videos and blog posts to follow.